Well, hi guys, it's me. It is uh, actually Sunday evening at about almost 6 o'clock, I guess. So I'm recording this for you guys for tomorrow, for April 20th, Monday the 20th, and that's our last week of classes. And yes, it's kind of weird. I'm wearing my thin turtleneck because I got a bit of a chill. The wind came out and it feels really good, but kind of weird to be wearing even slightly warmer clothes in April. But anyway, really beautiful weather we've been having, but it's cooling off a little bit tonight. I hope you guys are all doing well. I've been getting all of your submissions so far, and been reading through a bunch of reviews for all my classes actually, but certainly quite a few film reviews from you guys for this class. So thanks for doing that. Just real quickly, a reminder for you that we've got a couple of things coming up within the week. So there is not a final exam for this class, but you do have your greatest director critiques that you need to do for me, and those will be due next week on the day that our final exam is scheduled. So please check the calendar for that. And you have, most of that day to complete and submit those. So you should have plenty of time, but just keep that in your minds as you begin to prepare for next week. So this week is going to be devoted to going through some of the most recent films. So films that you guys have all experienced since probably around the time you were, 12-ish in your lives, and on to now. So we're going to actually do it this way. I'm going to start by going back through a couple of directors that we've already briefly talked about, and I'm going to introduce a couple of new ones that have come on the scene in the last few years. And then we'll roll back and deal with some of the prominent directors like Scorsese and Malick. We're going to do that on Friday because that's the day that extra credit assignment is due. So if you choose to watch Silence and A Hidden Life and do that comparative review, then that extra credit work would be due on Friday the 24th. And those two directors are actually going to be featured on that day. So I'm going to specifically talk about those two films for about 15 minutes on Friday. So we're going to come back to some of these filmmakers. We'll also be dealing with both new and old filmmakers a little bit on Wednesday. But I'm going to spend time today walking back through a couple of the directors we've dealt with, and then end with about a 5 or 10 minute segment on the MCU, which I know many of you are familiar with. Many of you have watched films from the Marvel Cinematic Universe and have enjoyed those. So I wanted to kind of find a way to wedge that in at some point this week, and I'm going to do that today. So here, let's start. Let's go back and revisit a couple things. So I updated a couple of slides because I'd forgotten to insert the newest film from Sam Mendes, which just came out December release in Britain, and then a wide release, theatrical release in the United States and Britain in, excuse me, I'm making sure my camera is working here for me. Yeah, it looks like it is. Okay, good. Whew. So Mendes, we've already dealt with, mentioned his first film, American Beauty, and some of you actually did review that for me. A couple students did anyway. I spent quite a bit of time on what I believe even to this point is still his masterpiece, although 1917 deserves to be in that conversation to be sure. But I wanted to just mention Sam Mendes again and deal with a couple of his films really quickly. So Beyond American Beauty and then Road to Perdition, which comes out in 2002. Mendes dabbled in a military drama early on with a film called Jarheads, dealing with modern warfare. It's actually a very well done film, to be honest with you. Definitely worth watching. Went back to deal with kind of a period drama, 1950s period drama with Revolutionary Road, reuniting Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet in those roles as a married couple that goes through quite a bit of life trauma together, and it's a pretty dark film, to be honest with you. But then Mendes did something that many film scholars were a little bit surprised by, and that is he took on the role of directing two consecutive James Bond films with Daniel Craig in the title role. And you know, these are both good films. The one in particular, Skyfall, has been widely regarded, and I think rightly so, as one of the great action adventure spy or espionage films of the 21st century. It just happens to be a James Bond film, although kind of like its predecessor, kind of like Casino Royale, which was done by a different director, by the way, but kind of like that film, the James Bond character was very much reinvented, and you know, the portrayal by Daniel Craig takes James Bond in a much different direction from many of his predecessors who played the role, going even all the way back to Sean Connery, who was the original James Bond actor. So updating this to Skyfall and Spectre, both of these films are you know, artistically speaking, quintessential Sam Mendes. A lot of great camera work, really, you know, integrating colors beautifully. He does that in all of his films, whether it's you know, the grays and the browns that you see pretty prominently in a film like Road to Perdition, a lot of the you know, much brighter color palette in a film like American Beauty. And then with something like Skyfall, you might expect that it's just a pretty straightforward, you know, action espionage piece, and yet there is an awful lot of cinematography and kind of I would say a fair amount of risk taking when it comes to a lot of the camera framing and the scene work, which kind of turned Skyfall into a more artistic piece, which you would not expect to find in a Bond film. So there are a number of different sequences where that becomes obvious, and I posted one of them. So the sequence that I posted that I thought was really brilliantly done. There are two that are just overpowering in a positive way with their graphic intensity and with the color patches that Mendes and his cinematographer are using in the film. There's a sequence where James Bond travels to Shanghai to hunt down an assassin there, and that's one of the ones that I posted for you. And I want you to look at that sequence. I think it's pretty powerful. It's a nighttime sequence for the most part. It starts out daytime, but then it moves pretty quickly to nighttime, and James Bond is trying to find this assassin in the upper stories of a skyscraper in Shanghai. And all of the, you know, the Asian motif of that region are worked into the framework. You know, the busyness, even the hustle bustle of the overcrowded, the vastly overcrowded cities like Shanghai. Certainly Hong Kong would be another one. These are features of that as well. But I love how he integrates the nighttime with the lights, with the different colors on the billboards and all of the flashing sequences you see in that particular, or flashing lights you see in that particular sequence. It's very, very well shot. There's another sequence in the film. I didn't post this one. I'm just going to mention it. The scene where he goes to Macau and he goes to this gambling house, and there's a Komodo dragon sequence there that's really interesting. But again, the color palettes there are much warmer, okay? A lot of oranges and yellows and some splotches of red that are shot in there. It's really just an absolutely gorgeous sequence, to be honest with you. Here, of all things, in a Bond film. So James Bond film, par excellence when it comes to Sam Mendes. The other sequence that I posed was just less artistic in nature. Actually, the cleverness of the film is that it's honoring a lot of the James Bond tradition, but also that it's kind of taking some of these villains, especially, you know, these famous Bond villains, right? Making them a highlight of these films has been a pretty consistent reality. But I love what Sam Mendes does with the Javier Bardem character, really. And Javier Bardem plays the guy just to the hilt, just a fantastic performance. And there's a sequence that I posted there that highlights both his, you know, his playful, menacing personality that comes to the forefront very effectively in that film. So I wanted you to watch that sequence as well. So two consecutive James Bond films, Skyfall and Spectre, both directed by Sam Mendes with a lot of artistic touches in them. Skyfall, I think, is the superior of the two, but they're both very well done. And then the other film that many of you have perhaps seen, and if you have not, I would highly recommend it, is the film 1917 that was just released widely in the United States in January of this year. And it is a long shot film, or at least that is the idea we are meant to take from it. As the audience watches the film, one of the things that is so engrossing is that you are meant to believe that you're watching everything happen sequentially in one continuous shoot. It didn't actually happen, of course, but there were a number of rather long shots in the film. So Mendes, much like if you watch Alfred Hitchcock's film Rope from 1948, much like that particular film, the idea is to draw the audience in by making them feel like they're a continual part of the plot sequence. You know what? I'm going to adjust my camera for just a second. All right. Just felt like it was not quite where I needed it to be. Okay, I think that's better. So 1917 story about, actually based on a couple of different it's a composite in a sense from a historical contextual perspective. It's a composite of a couple of different battles in 1917. And yet it's a very realistic representation of the Western Front during the course of that year. All of the destruction, you see the destruction that has been left as the two armies have been fighting one another for the preceding months and years. The grotesque, muddy, disastrous mess in what was once a beautiful French countryside in Western Europe. But the way the story is laid out, it also brings this sense of immediacy and also intimacy, in the sense that it's much harder, as Sam Mendes recognized, it's much harder for audiences to really be gripped by strategy and tactics. It's much more of a draw, much more magnetic, if you can provide a story with human beings that you become attached to in some way, and that you are, in this case, you're fearing for them, you're hopeful that these two characters will survive. And Mendes does a fantastic job of just drawing the audience in and keeping them on the edge of their seats as they're watching the protagonist, dodge through all of these different circumstances and difficulties as he tries to go and warn a part of the British combat force that they must not partake in an impending attack, because the Germans are ostensibly waiting for them and ready to pounce. So that's kind of the background, and yet the story, it unfolds dramatically, quickly. It's very fast-paced. There are moments where it dies down a little bit, but the action pacing certainly stays at a pretty high level for most of the film. So there's a frantic element about this, which was also very purposeful. The other thing I really love about 1917 is, although it's dealing with a pretty grim reality, the camera work is just outstanding. Even the depiction of the landscapes with Western Europe, with the Western Front, the grayish hues of the sky, sometimes with tinges of blue, but a lot of gray, a lot of rain in Western Europe. Touched with the tans and the browns, occasionally some greens. Really, really well done, and draws the eye into each sequence with some of the patches of color that are used, and really just a shockingly beautiful film, given the fact that it's dealing with the subject matter that it's focusing on. The other thing I love is the fact that this was a film that was primarily made for Mendes, I think, as an homage to his own grandfather, who fought in the First World War. So all of that really is interesting background. It's a really well done film. I think it belongs in the upper echelons of all-time great war films in the English language. I would not put it at in the top 2 or 3. I would probably put it somewhere in the top 10 or 15, and it certainly does belong there. It's definitely worth your time. So please watch the sequence that I posted. It's probably the most famous one from the film. where the protagonist finally is almost, he has almost reached his, he has almost reached the point where he can go and talk to the commanding general and ask him to call off the attack. So he's been fortunate enough to miraculously survive to this point, but he has to run this one last gauntlet across this field as the attack that he's supposed to be stopping is already beginning to get underway. And as all the action around him is going on, you're watching him, you know, run directly toward the camera and wondering if this is all going to be in vain. It's a very, very good film, and I would highly recommend it to you. So another great film from Sam Mendes. Okay. Nolan, we've talked about. I had to update this because I'd forgotten to include one of the great films I needed to speak about. And while I was at it, I went back through and I threw in Following, which was a film that Nolan made in 1998, his first film, which I would want you to at least be aware of. But now we're focusing on the second decade. So we've moved past some of the other Nolan films, some really good ones, and I want you to be aware of a few more. The last of which, at least presently, is Dunkirk. There is another Christopher Nolan film that was scheduled to come out this year that's now in question, although I think it probably will end up coming out maybe in the fall. We'll see. So Christopher Nolan has another film that is almost ready for release, given the COVID-19 crisis that the whole world is trying to weave its way through. Some of the release dates have been altered, so we'll see. But it's going to come out probably in the next 9 to 12 months, would be my guess. But I want to deal with two particular films from the 2010s. And before I do that, though, I want to mention the other two that I'm not going to spend as much time on. So one of them is the Last in the Dark Knight trilogy. I love the entire trilogy. Of the three, I think the first two are better, and I think the plot lines, the screenplay that of those first two is pretty off the charts, and especially with the Dark Knight. But it would be wrong to downgrade the Dark Knight Rises as anything like a mediocre film. I think it's actually a very good film, which says something about Christopher Nolan, that a film like this and the next one I'm going to talk about, Interstellar, that both of those, which are regarded as somewhat lesser Christopher Nolan films, that can lead you to the wrong conclusion that these are not great movies. But the reality is they're very well done. And there are some fitting conclusions to the Dark Knight trilogy in the film. I really was one of many who went to the film and was shocked by the Tom Hardy portrayal of Bane, because Tom Hardy put on like 50 pounds of packed on 50 pounds of muscle for that role. This doesn't even look like Tom Hardy. And I like the way that the film brings the character Selina Kyle, right? So the Anne Hathaway is in the film, and she plays Selina Kyle, or Catwoman. And these are very effective set pieces. They play well because of the comic book trilogy that we've already been watching. And of course, Christopher Nolan allows Christian Bale and Michael Caine, those two characters, to really have, to be featured very highly, very heavily in this last film. And it's about overcoming. There's definitely this redemptive impulse in the film that I think is pretty powerful. So I don't want to throw that one out and not mention it, but I'm not going to focus on it. We've already dealt with the Dark Knight some in our conversations here, or in my Zoom lectures. The other film is Interstellar. For me, this is kind of a hot and cold film. So in many respects, the cinematography, the graphics in this film, they're impressive. They're the sequence with the black hole in particular is just gorgeous. Actually reminds me of a different film called Sunshine, came out a few years ago, with the graphic intensity of the solar system. But this is a very interesting film. The plot lines are pretty complex, and yet they play well. The film reminds me, at least at some level, of 2001: A Space Odyssey. A lot of critics commented on this, and I think they're right. I think Christopher Nolan dared, dared pretty big here, and he rolled the dice a little bit about trying to bring in something that was so ethereal into the film, and to deal with, we're meant to believe that the characters are questioning the existence of a higher power in the film, and maybe that higher power is making himself known and to different characters. We're meant to wonder if this is what's going on, and then it turns out that it really is just about secular humanism at the very end of the film. Human beings rescuing themselves. Everything is about human capacity in that sense. Actually, I think the film score is one of the highlights of the film, to be honest with you. But the performances are good and the story is interesting. I don't know that I would cast it as one of the very best Christopher Nolan films, and yet I do think it's worth watching. Okay. So, two that I'm going to focus on: Inception, and then I'm going to deal with Dunkirk. Inception, I think, is one of the great sci-fi films in the English language of all time. I think it is not only a very clever film, but a very well executed film. From a conceptual framework, I love that it has the psychological complexity to it, the layers of dreaming and what reality really is, how there's the very deep existential themes in the film about how we invent our realities from a secular existentialist perspective. There's an awful lot of psychology that's thrown into the film, obviously. The set pieces, the imagery, everything is very convincingly done. The characterization is functioning at a very high level, not just the Dom Cobb character played by Leonardo DiCaprio, but the entire cast of characters are just wonderful in the film. Inception, as I said, from a conceptual framework, it does work. It is complex. It is meant to be. American audiences seem to have forgotten how to think. When the film first came out, this was one of the constant complaints, even from people that I talked to in my own sphere of conversation in my life. A lot of people said, yeah, I couldn't watch it because I had no idea what was going on. It was too confusing. To which I said, well, maybe give it another chance. Maybe drink a cup of coffee or something before you watch the film so you can stay conscious and focused, and then you can probably follow it through okay. I think actually if you're able to just work through the film as an entertainment piece, the construct actually is very clever, and it's requiring the audience to be engaged, but actually I think that really is a helpful thing for this film. It is a much more of a thought-provoking sci-fi piece in that sense. So conceptually, I think it's brilliant. The levels of dreaming, a dream within a dream within a dream, that is one of the great set pieces of the film. I also love the artistic work in this film. And again, when obviously there are some special effects frameworks that are used in the film, that is obvious, and yet as much as can possibly be done is shot with actual, not just the physical actors at times, but also physical set pieces as much as they possibly could. So there are two sequences I posted in the film. The one that I really loved was the set piece where Cobb is explaining to Ariadne in this little bistro, this little market, about dreaming world and about the dream world and how it functions, and she comes to the realization, oh, you mean that we're dreaming right now? And then these explosions are taking place, and you would like to think, well, that's all CGI, but one of the reasons that it works so well is, although there were a couple of real brief CGI shots that were ultimately mapped out and stuck in there, a lot of that sequence was actually done with all sorts of exploding objects being shot into the screen and into the camera lens as the actor and the actress are sitting there, whether it's a flower or what have you. And it's actually just gorgeous. It's actually reminiscent of a Renoir painting when you first look at that sequence. Great example of both the merging of idea with technology and artistry, just perfectly done throughout the film, but that's a particularly wonderful sequence. The other one that I posted that I think is just fantastic, quintessential Nolan, is Nolan deciding that, again, he's going to go against the grain, and he's going to rely as much as possible on real live actors and physical objects in the filming process. So there's a great sequence when one of the characters, one of the main characters, is played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt, where his character is in this hallway and he is combating villains is kind of the wrong word. He's combating invaders, right? Who are invading the dream sequence, and they're walking on the walls and on the ceilings, and things are kind of spinning around, and it relates to another level of the dream that we are made aware of as a vehicle is turning over, which is why this is happening. And quintessential, as I said, quintessential Nolan, because they constructed a rotating camera set. So the actors were actually physically moving around in an actual rotating camera set in order to make sure that the human eye was really accepting what it was seeing. Because one of the things with CGI that has proven to be a real problem, even with really well done CGI, is it's very hard to trick the human eye. The human eye is such a complex organ, right? So wonderfully constructed, so wonderfully made, that it can tell oftentimes when something is a false construct, visually speaking. And so Christopher Nolan, as he does with almost all of his films, virtually every film he's made, he goes out of his way to make sure that he maintains that physical connection. And he does that certainly in Inception. I think it is a phenomenal film, obviously worth your time. The other film is Christopher Nolan's first foray into historical epic, and he deals with one of the more famous events of World War II, the evacuation of British soldiers at Dunkirk, which was essential to the war. If that had not happened, then World War II would have gone very differently, I can tell you. The German invasion of the British Isles almost assuredly would have happened in 1940. And the war in Europe would have been a very different, would have probably worked toward a very different conclusion, way before the United States would have had a presence in the conflict. So, critical event of the Second World War, and Nolan is not dealing with grand strategy in this particular picture. He wants to give the audience the feel of the war. He wants to make this a visceral experience for the audience. And he wants to bring them in on the experiences of the average soldier, the experiences of some commanders, and also to differentiate between land combat, naval combat, and air combat. And so he has this really, again, very typical Christopher Nolan framework, where he has a converging timeline, a timeline from about a week out, a timeline from about a day out, and a timeline from about an hour out, working in, all converging together into one final resolution. And as I said, the sequences are meant to integrate those three different timelines and merge them into a final point, but all through the lens of land combat, naval combat, and air combat. And the film score, wonderful as always, but it is just the narrative creation, right, of Nolan and David S. Goyer, who is one of his writers. Really just very clever. It works beautifully. If you watch the film and you're kind of confused at first, then stay patient and watch how it all comes together. And it's actually a very impressive experience for the audience. The scene I posted is just I didn't want to post multiple scenes on this one. I think that the one sequence just shows off Nolan at his best. Again, bringing together the physical as much as he could. So again, with the air combat scene that I posted, it's actually the one I did was the first dogfight, where the Spitfires are first introduced to the audience as they're watching. The Spitfire aircraft, one of the great fighter planes of all time, and the the Spitfire crews were responsible for holding the German air crews at bay, not only during the evacuation of Dunkirk, but through most of that year and on into the Battle of Britain later on in the fall. These Spitfires were absolutely instrumental in holding off the German invasion. Beautiful aircraft, by the way. So when I lived in Britain, we were near an RAF base, and they were still flying those Spitfires out, on occasion for various air shows. So I've seen those Spitfires fly a number of times. That Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, as it comes roaring overhead, man, there's just really nothing like it. The Mark Rylance character even says it in the film, and he's absolutely right. There's just nothing like the sound of those Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. Just gorgeous. So the sequence you watch, it's actually, there are two things that Nolan did. He had a couple of vintage aircraft that they used for the film, and they actually flew, so they mounted cameras on the wings and were filming with those. But they also used models, so model airplanes, with engines, right? So that they're flying up there and they're banking and they're using those. So that's how they filmed those sequences, and they look so absolutely real and gorgeous. And the reason is that they actually filmed them. So something like a throwback. It's almost like you're watching a film that was made 50 years ago or more. Very clever. I love, there are some really good performances in the film. None better, honestly, in my opinion, than the Tom Hardy character. His character name in the film is Farrier, so he's one of the Spitfire pilots. And it amazes me even now that Tom Hardy can act so well with his eyebrows and with the look of panic. Well, not always panic, but the look of fear, consternation, concern. He conveys the emotion of a fighter pilot very thoroughly and well, even though you really don't see a whole lot of his face. And just a reminder of how good an actor Tom Hardy is, and he's really good in the film. Kind of stole the show, to be honest with you. So another great film from Christopher Nolan. Now, dipping into another great director who really has come into his own in the 21st century. There are a couple of films that come out in around 2010, 2011 that were foreign language films. He begins to move beyond the foreign language environment and into a little bit more mainstream English language film by 2012 and 2013. Films like Enemy certainly stand out there. Another film called Prisoners is actually one of the great Denis Villeneuve films that have a pretty big impact, actually. But he makes it big with a film that comes out in 2015 called Sicario. And it's a political thriller kind of a film. There's the context is the U.S. war against the drug lords from Latin America, but it's much more complex than that. And I love that in this film, Villeneuve and his production crew are very good about, again, humanizing the characters in this film and not allowing it to be something that is cold and removed, like strategy against the different cartels that exist in Latin America. And he does this with some fantastic plot outlining, but also this is accomplished through some spectacular performances by those actors and actresses who populate his story. So in Sicario, there are a couple of clips I posted. So the Sicario basic storyline is an FBI agent named Kate is asked to join a task force, and a U.S. task force to try to kind of break through and make a bigger impact in the fight against the drug cartels and all of the massive drugs that are pouring into our country through primarily through the southern border. And Kate is she's not a newbie FBI agent, but she's certainly not overly familiar with the broad world of politics and espionage, and she finds herself in way over her head very quickly. And the character that stands out in the film that really kind of steals the show is the character's name is Alejandro, played by Benicio del Toro in the film. And as the different characters are kind of coming together and they're existing in this film and they're carrying out, and the story is being carried out around them, we see there's a character played by Josh Brolin named Matt, right? And he's pretty seedy, and we get that pretty quickly. His whole concern is to kind of take the gloves off. He's wanting the United States government to play dirty and to go down and kind of behave like the people they're claiming are evil. So this is one of the key elements of the film. What is the United States prepared to do in order to make a difference in the war against these drug lords, and in trying to combat those scenarios? And Villeneuve and his screenwriters have done a fantastic job of pulling out all the stops and making the audience realize, man, what this film portrays is U.S. drug policy that does not appear to be aligned with ethics. And that, the question comes to the forefront: is it possible to fight that kind of a war ethically? Are you going to have any victories if you are always worried about the rules of engagement, or if you are actually behaving in a clear-cut moral and ethical fashion? This is one of the key set pieces of the film. And as I said, the character that really captures our attention is this Benicio del Toro character. He's very shadowy. He's a covert operative who joins this task force, and it becomes clear that his primary mission is different than all the others. He is the shadowy assassin. He is the guy that is going to be used ultimately to go and find the key drug lord that is the focal point of this story, and he's going to be sent in to deal with him. And all of this is revolving around, the broad geopolitical scenario, but also the ways in which these characters are populating the narrative, and the way in which Kate, in particular, the way in which she is ultimately, a lot of this is revealed to her gradually, and her eyes are opened to the dark, heinous realities of the U.S. policy against the drug lords, even though she knows those drug lords are indeed nasty, horrible, rotten people. The opening sequence of the film leaves no doubt about how evil these drug lords are, and that they've actually infiltrated our country in the southern borders in places like New Mexico and Arizona. And yeah, it's nasty all the way around. And yet I really, really love the way Villeneuve brings all this together and makes us care about these different individuals. Even the corrupt cop down in Mexico, we come to realize that he's playing a game that he just cannot possibly win, and he's in way over his head, and that proves to be very true at the end of the film. But you see his family, you see all of the, you see it to a certain extent the realities of these individuals in the film and how they are populating it, and it really is a very effectively done movie for that reason. So I posted a couple clips. The first one brings to light the methods of engagement. There's this border crossing, and the agents, this task force, they're in their cars and they suspect there might be some hoodlums in a car nearby, and they disperse, and you'll see how the scene plays out. And then ultimately the last sequence in the film is powerful and tragic and sad and horrible and all the rest. Kate has lived through the whole thing. She gets to the end, but she doesn't feel right about what she experienced, and how the actual rules of engagement were kind of thrown out the window, and how the United States covert operations groups, in her experience, decided to just kind of make new rules for themselves and do whatever they wanted. And she's told the powers that be, her immediate bosses, that she's gonna tell people and she's gonna make them aware. And they send Alejandro, of all people, to deal with her in her hotel room. And it's one of the great closing sequences of any film. It's powerful. It's not an action sequence. It is just a powerful emotional sequence, and very, very well done. So again, Denis Villeneuve in the film Sicario, not to be missed. One of the great films of the 21st century. There's no doubt. The other film, number 2 with Denis Villeneuve, is a great film called Arrival, starring Amy Adams and Jeremy Renner. More Amy Adams actually than Jeremy Renner. I think he's really good, as he always tends to be, but Amy Adams just is phenomenal in Arrival. Very clever film that deals. It's an alien. You're wondering if it's a typical alien invasion film at first, perhaps, but it's not, and it becomes clear as the film progresses that this is a film that's dealing with questions about time, questions about our humanity, our experiences, how we construct them. There's even this element of Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence that is at the heart and core of this film. Very clever, philosophically rich, a thinking man's sci-fi piece, if ever there was one. And it's just so engrossing and clever and emotionally charged. There's just no way to not watch the film and be intrigued by it. I even love the ways in which the aliens are portrayed and how the communication between human beings and these heptapods comes to be, and that's the link that I posted for you. One of the major questions of the film that we're at first confused by, as we see Amy Adams, we think her character is remembering something that already happened to her at the beginning of the film, and we find out later on that this is not a past memory. It is something that has been revealed to her through her interactions with these heptapod aliens about her destiny, her future. And it's a tragic, we believe, memory. It's a tragic memory, and yet we find that one of the conclusions of the film is that even if human life goes through trauma and even tragedy, that the lives we have are worth living, and the people that we love and interact with are absolutely worth knowing and loving and investing in. And it's pretty powerful, and I really love how it's brought together very cleverly in what is ostensibly just a sci-fi film. So Amy Adams, Jeremy Renner, the two key stars in Arrival, but also a very clever philosophical piece that I would highly recommend to you. Okay, the other film that of the 2010s that should have probably gotten an awful lot more attention, but American audiences in particular were not prepared for a thinking man sci-fi film that was about 3 hours long, and so they didn't flock to the theaters. It's a sequel, actually, to the 1982 film by Ridley Scott called Blade Runner. And, it's just such a perfect merging, a way to pay homage to the 82 film, and even bringing in the Deckard character from the first film and having him come back into the second film. But it's also a very original construction in its own right. So, and boy, the film score, again, connects well to the original film in some respects, but it's thoroughly engaging in an entirely innovative way for the 2017 film. So Blade Runner 2049 is building on the story from the first Blade Runner film about replicants and human beings and how they interact, questions of what makes us human. it's doing that broadly through a lot of interesting cultural observations, but it's also doing this through the narrative and the characters that populate this film. So one of the things, a second, just trying to make sure that this is working right. So one of the things that I love is that you're connected immediately in Blade Runner 2049 with this character Kay, played by Ryan Gosling. And throughout the film, one of the things that Villeneuve does is he makes you wonder whether Kay could possibly be a born being, which is to say he was not created in a lab. And that's one of the question marks that's swirling throughout the film. You're also meant to question, is he perhaps Deckard's child that he apparently had with the replicant Rachel? And this is another aspect of the film. How is that possible? Replicants who were able to have children, that wasn't supposed to be able to happen. It's bringing a lot of these question marks to the forefront, and it's doing so very effectively. It's also, honestly, it's just an absolutely gorgeous film from a cinematography perspective. And if you watch the film, it's one of the things that comes to light very quickly. The urban scape that is created by Villeneuve reflects what we would have seen earlier in the 1982 original film, and he adds to that world building when he takes the film in some new directions. So he takes it to the garbage heaps and the outskirts of Los Angeles. There are some seascapes involved in the film. There's a gorgeous desert scape out toward Las Vegas, and that whole sequence is just phenomenal. So just from a visual perspective, it's overwhelmingly beautiful, really a gorgeous film. But it's very satisfying as a narrative as well. And a lot of the characters, the conclusions of the narrative arc that began in the 1982 film, they come back around and we see them work to the forefront here. Not only with the Kay character and questions about his origins and his destiny, there's a really clever character in the film who's an artificial construct completely. Her name is Joy, and she exists as Kay's girlfriend of sorts, and yet she is a visual creation of the Wallace Corporation, which you learn about in the film. And even the character of Joy is just a very clever and highly welcome addition to the film. Really interesting. So these are all of these films really seize upon audiences in Britain and some in the United States. Blade Runner 2049 did well with critics, but American audiences didn't go to see it quite as much as they probably should have in the theaters when it was in its theatrical release. It has since garnered more and more and more attention, and my suspicion is that in another couple of years, much like the original, it's going to be regarded as one of the great sci-fi films of the 21st century. And Villeneuve is one of the great artists. His remake of the sci-fi classic Dune is also due out in the near future. That timeline may switch because of the COVID-19 virus, but be looking for Villeneuve and his upcoming film Dune, which should be a very good film too. I'm anticipating a very fine, engrossing film as always from the Canadian director. Okay, which brings us to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And this is where we're gonna end. I'm not gonna spend too long because you guys, I know a lot of you have seen at least one or more of these films. There are, 20 or so films and to this point in the MCU. And that's one of the points I want to talk about right away. So I posted 3 clips. They're from 3 different, I try to space them out a little bit. The first one, I don't want one of you wiseacres to point out the fact that the first one I posted was from 2008 instead of the 2010s. I get it, but the first film in the MCU that was released was in 2008, and it was the original Iron Man. So deal with it. I just wanted to have a starting point for us. So the original Iron Man, I posted a great clip from when Tony Stark is learning how to fly in his new suit that he's created. Classic Tony Stark, actually. very, very fun sequence. I posted three clips, and before all of you send me emails complaining, which probably wouldn't happen. I'm just teasing. I'm being a bit facetious with you here. But before you even think about a complaint, I like these films. There was only one, the Incredible Hulk film that was done in 2008 or 2009. I forget offhand. I thought that was not overly great. I didn't love Iron Man 2 all that much. I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it. And there are a few more films in the MCU that I didn't think were stupendous. But for the most part, these are very good, very engaging, creative films. And just from a narrative arc perspective, I love that the producers and the various directors were able to bring together the many plot points and the many different characters and all these crazy story arcs that were existing independently, at least seemingly independently, and to bring them together in such a cohesive and helpful and entertaining framework. Now, I personally am of the mindset that maybe the world needs a break from superhero films. I think that whole genre at the moment has been saturated. I think we could probably use a decade away, at least, maybe 20 years. I'm not really sure. However, there's no doubt that these films captured the audience's attention, and a lot of people just gravitated toward them. And these Marvel films were very, very well made for the most part. The other two I posted, one was from the film that I think is, for me, just stands out both dramatically and from not only from a narrative perspective, but also from an artistic perspective. And I absolutely love Captain America: The Winter Soldier. I think it is one of the great films, period, of 2014. I think it should have gotten quite a bit more critical attention than it did, even though it was well received. I think that one's probably the high point for me, although I love a whole slew of others too. I love Thor Ragnarok. I think that's very clever. I loved both Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. I loved the original Avengers from 2012. I thought that was very entertaining. I loved Guardians of the Galaxy. Those are very clever films. Even Doctor Strange, although took a little time to warm up to that one. I like it. The new Spider-Man films are very, very clever as well. We could keep going. I like a lot of these films, but the three I posted just kind of give you a taste of a flavor of the MCU. Got Iron Man, Captain America, and then ultimately the closing sequence with Endgame, which of course is a very emotionally rich, and I think tragic but fulfilling end of the film. Perfect ending, if I'm being honest. I think they pulled that off very, very well. So these films are, I think, reminders that what Christopher Nolan started with Batman Begins back in 2005 was, obviously made a dent. That you could take comic book superhero characters and make dramatic, effective, thoughtful films that were deeply entertaining. And you could have a 10-year-old watch the film, and you could have a 40-year-old watch the film, and both of them be entertained, and maybe be entertained for different reasons. So these films work on a number of different emotional levels. They also work on a number of different dramatic levels and action adventure set piece levels. They're very, very well done. So I'm sure if I asked you guys, you could probably tell me all sorts of sequences and all sorts of movies that you thought were the best. I know a lot of folks love Black Panther. I like Black Panther too. I think it's a good film. Ryan Coogler is the director for that, and he's an up and coming brilliant director. I think he's going to have quite a career. I love what he did with Creed. I thought that was a phenomenal film, to be honest with you. So yes, I think there are some great films, some great directors that were handed the reins to them. And to a degree, I'll probably miss the first phase of the MCU films. But like I said a few minutes ago, I'm of the mindset that you don't want to scare audiences away by oversaturating things. And I think if they're smart, the Marvel studio will pull back the reins a little bit and let people enjoy going back through these 20 films and enjoying them as they're meant to. Somebody asked me the other day, actually, because I mentioned I was probably going to do the MCU. You know, is their favorite sequence? Well, I love Thor. I love Captain America. Those are my two favorites. I also like Iron Man. He's absolutely hilarious, and Robert Downey Jr. is fantastic playing Iron Man. There's no doubt. But I grew up reading a lot of Thor comics and Captain America comics, and so those two I kind of gravitated toward more than the others. I loved the original Kenneth Branagh directed Thor. I thought it was clever, but I really think that the Captain America films were very well done, and I love the Avengers films, bringing everybody together too. So I guess if I were to specify one sequence, man, it's a little bit tough. You guys are holding my feet to the fire here. All right, I'll go with this one. So I think my favorite may actually be from Avengers Infinity War, when Captain America enters the film for the first time. There's a battle going on with the Scarlet Witch and Iron Man's former butler turned computer superhero. There's a battle between these minions and whatnot going on, and they're in this train station, this deserted train station at night, and all of a sudden one of the evil minions, looks up and sees this shadowy figure, and she throws this spear-looking thing, and there's Captain America for the first time in the film, and he looks a little bit the worse for wear. He looks pretty unkempt. He's got the beard going on, and the music starts up. Yeah, I think that's probably one of my favorite sequences. So you asked, I'm doing my best, I suppose. All right, guys, that's it. That was a longer one. I apologize for the length, but I want to make sure that I get through this stuff this week. So I hope you're well. I will be posting a number of things between now and Wednesday, the 22nd, but this should get us through for the time being. See you later.